After the HMS Wager's castaways fixed the longboat, the Speedwell, the question was in which direction to take her. Should they go north and carry out the mission against the Spaniards with Captain David Cheap, or head south and try to get home to England via the Strait of Magellan with Gunner John Bulkeley? Captain Cheap claimed he was willing to go with what the majority wanted, but when push came to shove, he demanded everyone go north with him to fight the enemy in the War of Jenkins's Ear. Those on Wager Island then arrested the captain for his rash killing of midshipman Henry Cousins. They were going south, and the captain refused to go with them. Only two others, the Wager surgeon Walter Elliot and Marine Lieutenant Thomas Hamilton, chose to stay behind with him. On March 13, 1741, 81 people embarked on 3 boats and sailed for the Strait of Magellan. I am Yvette, this is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 4 of the story of the HMS Wager, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. This video was made possible with the help of my Patreon subscribers. Thank you all. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. Team Bulkeley began its voyage to the Strait of Magellan in the barge, the cutter, and the retrofitted longboat. They'd been eager to get moving and felt a little hope and a lot of dread about what they were sailing into. Officially, Lieutenant Baines was in charge, but Gunner Bulkeley called the shots, so that the men saw him as the new captain. They planned to put into harbor every night, because they were in no shape to survive out on the rough seas for many hours. They needed to get provisions on land, because what they had on board would only last them a few days. Their supplies depended on the success of their guns and on how much they could scavenge between the rocks. But they hadn't even left Cheap's Bay, or disaster struck. A sudden burst of wind split the Speedwell's topsail, and she was about to crash onto the rocks. But with the help of oars and the barge, she was pulled off and sailed into a large sandy bay on a lagoon, where they went for anchor. They had traveled barely a mile. The folks in the barge and the cutter went ashore, but also several men from the Speedwell, who'd rather spend the night on the forlorn and desolate land than in the uncomfortable crammed boat. They named the bay Speedwell Bay. After fixing the sail and a few test runs on the lagoon the following day, they were ready to set sail again, but the rough seas prevented them from getting out. Meanwhile, Gunner Bulkeley decided it was necessary to draw up a kind of memorial addressed to the Lords of the Admiralty, informing them about why they had seized the captain and that he was left behind at his own request. It was signed by 10 people, several high-ranking officers of the Wager, plus Captain Robert Pemberton and the surgeon Vincent Oakley of the land forces. After spending 2 nights at the lagoon, they fired 5 musket shots, a signal to set sail again. But it didn't take long for a frenzied wind to pick up, forcing the boats into another bay, where they were sheltered behind a ledge of rocks. They organized another hunting trip. Midshipman Alexander Campbell was still in shock that the mutineers had left Captain Cheap with only a few friends, no seaworthy vessel, and a few rusted weapons. Midshipman John Byron was equally shocked. He had only embarked on the Speedwell under the assumption that the captain was brought along. Now that Cheap hadn't, Byron was determined to return at the first opportunity he got. Campbell had the same idea and discussed it with those in the barge. If they ever made it to England, a big if, they'd be hanged for mutiny. But if they returned to the captain, they'd go northward, where they had a much better chance of surviving. Everyone on the barge readily agreed. However, if they returned, they'd have no provisions, and they couldn't very well ask for them. They'd probably lose the barge. The moment they came to anchor, Campbell went on the Speedwell to talk to Gunner Bulkeley. As luck would have it, their de facto captain ordered him to return to Wager Island with the barge and fetch Captain Pemberton's tent they could use as backup sails. In their hurry to get off Wager Island, they hadn't thought to bring extra canvas on board. Byron, realizing this was his chance, told Bulkeley he would join those in the barge. Bulkeley noted in his trusty journal, "Went in the barge the Honourable John Byron at his own request, Alexander Campbell, midshipman, William Harvey, quarter-gunner, David Buckley, ditto, William Ross, quartermaster, Richard Noble, ditto, Peter Plasto, captain steward, Joseph Clinch, seaman, and Roland Crusset, marine. The 10th man he forgot to mention was Seaman John Bosman." The mutinying mutineers were a little on edge, half expecting their new chief to figure out what they were planning and come after them. But he didn't. That evening, Captain Cheap was surprised to see the barge sail into Cheap's Bay with 10 men on board. Had they changed their mind? Were they going to carry them off? Or finish him off? When they explained they'd return in his support, he gave them a very warm welcome. That night, Byron and Campbell had dinner with Captain Cheap, Lieutenant Hamilton, and Surgeon Elliot, excitedly discussing their plans into the wee hours of the night. There were now 20 people on Wager Island, 13 at base camp, and 7 at the deserters' camp. Team Cheap had one usable boat, the barge, and intended to fix the yawl. Then they would go north. On October 16th, while Team Bulkeley patiently waited for the return of the barge, the cutter returned with a ton of shellfish, prepared and ready to eat. Carpenter Cummins reported noticing a cannon and a large weather-worn anchor sticking out of the sand, another shipwreck victim. Meanwhile, Team Cheap was considering their options and their lack of food. While the captain readily shared his portion with the returned men, they needed more. Midshipman Byron floated the idea of trying to get their shares of provisions from Team Bulkeley, who were still waiting for the barge to return. The captain agreed, but feared that if they sailed up in the barge, they'd take it from them. New plan. They'd sail the barge to the lagoon out of sight from Team Bulkeley and then walk over to the Speedwell. On October 18th, Byron and Campbell and 7 others embarked on this mission. Once at the lagoon, the midshipmen headed out while the rest guarded the barge. The duo traveled all day, through thick woods and across nasty swamps until they finally reached the location of the Speedwell in the evening. They found most men on land, scavenging for shellfish from the rocks. Byron told Gunner Bulkeley and Lieutenant Baines that the barge was safe in the bay where they left her and only waited for the opportunity of weather to come around with her. Campbell was more to the point. He wanted the rations of 10 men who would stay with the captain and some of his stuff in the boat. A mutineer shouted, "No, damn you! You will have nothing unless you return the barge!" No one wanted them to give an ounce of anything, saying that if they didn't return with the barge the following day, they'd send armed men in the cutter after them. Well, Campbell wasn't worried. If the cutter came after them, they'd take her too. Campbell simply argued that the deal had been from the beginning that if the 10 in the barge wanted to stay behind, the captain could have the barge. Byron left in a panic. They had rations for 3 people on Wager Island. They'd picked the beaches clean and the wreck was basically all robbed out. Bulkeley was baffled by the men's betrayal. He figured Campbell coerced the young Byron. Or maybe the aristocratic midshipman was uncomfortable living forward with the common men. It was indeed a very tight squeeze, with 59 men crammed in the Speedwell. The hold was a dark, dank and dismal place. An English jail cell would be more roomy and comfortable compared to this. It was hard to even operate the ship or switch places, but the 12 on the cutter had it worse. They had no hold and sat on wooden planks. 2 days later, Byron once more tried to convince Bulkeley to give them their supplies, but he got nothing. So he went fishing with the others. When Byron disappeared again, Bulkeley and 8 people made the trek to the lagoon, hoping to get the canvas that was so sorely needed. But the barge was gone, and no canvas was left behind. They were stunned at the loss of the barge. They had only the cutter left to ferry people to shore to get supplies. If anything happened to her, they'd starve. When the midshipmen returned to Wager Island empty-handed, the captain said, "So be it," and shared his provision and clothes with everyone. But they had to look for food. Team Bulkeley looked for the barge all day, but didn't find it. While they could have gone back to Wager Island to take the barge by force, they were still close enough, Bulkeley was determined to keep going south. There was no looking back now. Team Bulkeley slowly made their way south, but because of the bad weather, they frequently anchored in bays. On October 30th at 6 p.m, the next harbor had a narrow opening, too narrow for Bulkeley's liking. But they had no choice but to chance it, because they couldn't spend another hour at sea. With nothing but death before their eyes by continuing at sea, and death before their eyes in trying to go inland, they went inland. Fortunately, they landed in a calm, very large lagoon, large enough to hold the entire British Navy, Bulkeley reckoned, and it even had a rocky outcropping that served as a dock. All those who were able went ashore to find food. They found plenty, and enough wood to start a fire. They came across a few abandoned wigwams, but no people. Then the weather kept them stuck there for 2 days. Many people suffered from stomach aches and had pains in their sides. Below decks, they were so tightly packed that their lodging was very uncomfortable. They were always wet from the spray, which made the stench of the men's clothes and the air they breathed so nauseous that it was as if someone had died below. How anyone spent any time down there was one of life's mysteries. And then they had to do their business over the side of the ship, which wasn't exactly sanitary either. On November 2nd, Bulkeley calculated they were in the latitude of 50 degrees. Bulkeley thought he recognized a few islands that Narborough had written about. They were on the right track. Now that Captain Cheap no longer had to worry about the always on the verge of mutiny crew, he could freely execute his plan to go north. They'd go to the island of Chiloé, lay in wait to seize a merchant vessel, and use it to meet up with Commodore Anson. The captain asked the deserters if they wanted to join Team Cheap. They did, and now 20 men were at base camp. But how to make the journey? The yawl's broadside was entirely out, and the barge was so beat up from use it needed repairs, but they had no carpenter. Instead, Team Cheap had to make do with what skills they learned from working on the longboat with Cummins. But on a good day, a rarity, they were able to go out to the last remains of the wreck for supplies. They used a hook on a stick to fish for 3 casks of beef, which they distributed equally so that everyone would be strong enough to leave the island. And Captain Cheap, who, ever since the loss of the ship, had hardly ever left his tent, seemed revived and turned out to be an excellent cook. His slaw cakes were the best anyone ever had on the island. On November 3rd, 1741, Team Bulkeley rounded what they called Cape Good Hope, but the cutter missed a turn. The Speedwell raised an ensign to show them the way, but then the cutter split her mainsail and struggled. Team Bulkeley offered to tow her, but the 12 men refused, drifting leeward into a bay. With the weather being so bad, the Speedwell was forced to pursue them. Then they lost sight of the cutter. Faced with dangerous rocks and breakers, they turned around, battling strong winds, tides, and hazardous submerged rocks until the Speedwell finally reached the safety of another bay. At 4 a.m. the following morning, those in the Speedwell rowed out again and sailed on, until 3 hours later they saw the cutter behind them. The Speedwell dropped the mainsail and the foresail just enough to avoid drifting into a bay so she could catch up with them. After 4 hours, the cutter caught up, and the Speedwellians yelled at them to take the tow rope. The Cutterians refused, shouting that the boat would be destroyed by the swell. "Come over here, the water is smooth." The Speedwellians answered that the water was more smooth on their side. "Come on board and we'll tow the empty cutter." But the Cutterians didn't come on board, didn't want to be towed, didn't make sail, and didn't row. "Fine, have it your way." The Speedwell made sail and moved further out to sea. When the Cutterians realized the Speedwellians weren't going into the bay, they hoisted their mainsail and sailed ahead. Then they lost sight of the cutter again. After a few miles they discovered a bay, and despite the sea making the eldest sailor fear for their lives, they managed to sail in. They were now in a most wretched condition. They had no boat to go ashore with to find food. Only a few could swim. They mourned the loss of their mates in the cutter by listing the names, rank, age, and place of birth. Now stuck, Boatswain John King crafted a raft of oars and water barrels, large enough to carry 3 men. But the moment it was launched, it tipped over, forcing the people to swim for their lives. 2 were pulled out of the water into the Speedwell, but the boatswain got hold of the raft and reached the shore. The following morning, they saw the cutter. Everyone rejoiced. The cutter was immediately deployed to get food. Her crew got on the Speedwell, and the cutter was tied to the stern. Only 2 men remained on board. Late that evening, one of the 2 Kotarians climbed into the Speedwell. Then the weather turned dark. That night, the cutter broke loose and James Stewart, the lone man on board, cried out for help. They tried to save him, but they lost sight of the cutter, which must have broken on the rocks and sank. The definitive loss of the cutter was a disaster. Not only because they couldn't hope to get the Speedwell to shore to get food, she now had to carry 72 men. And of those 72, no more than 6 cared whether they lived or died. With a mutiny brewing, Baines, Bulkeley and Cummins needed to get the men in line. So they threatened them. Unless they followed commands, the trio would go to shore and leave them in the Speedwell to fend for themselves. That whipped the people into shape. On November 8th, 4 days after the week's rations had been given out, the men demanded next week's rations. But if they ate now, they'd starve later. They had no way to go on land, did they? Well, they didn't care. To keep the men quiet, the ration was served. Then there was an odd request. Several people wanted to be put ashore with some supplies. Okay, but why? Look at the state of things. They weren't gonna be any worse off on land than in the boat. They'd look for the cutter or build a canoe and go north. And so, 11 Speedwellians were dropped off close to the shore with some supplies and provisions, but not before signing a certificate to inform the Lords of the Admiralty that they left on their own free will and for the preservation of the rest. That night, the Speedwell weighed anchor, and the men rowed out of the bay, then sailed on, always trying to dodge breakers and steer clear of the rocks that were everywhere. On November 10th at 4 a.m., Bulkeley saw some landmarks Sir John Narborough had mentioned, Cape Victory and the 4 Islands of Direction. They had reached the mouth of the Strait of Magellan. On Wager Island, the weather was bad all November. Team Cheap's supply of shellfish, their main meal, was gone. The captain's provisions had run dry, so they had nothing but slaw cakes fried with the tallow from the candles that kept washing ashore from the wreck. They became so weak they could hardly walk. Just as hunger was about to take them all down, they saw the friendly Coescar arrive in 2 canoes. They hoped to get relief, but they'd brought nothing except a few dogs, and the weather was so bad they couldn't dive for mussels or catch seals. They left shortly after, only leaving them a few of their dogs, which the survivors killed and ate. On days when the weather permitted it, they used the repaired yawl to shoot what seafowl they could. A few days after the Coescar left them with virtually nothing, 3 men, steward Peter Plasto, the boatswain's yeoman John Redwood, and a marine Cressick, stole some flour reserved for the journey north from the store tent. The thieves were found by the trail of little white bits of flour that led straight to their tent. The captain confined them in another hut until they confessed, which they soon did. That night, Plasto made his escape and hid in the woods. The following day, Redwood and Cressick were tied to a tree, severely whipped, and ordered to be marooned on an island. Cressick escaped, but Midshipman Byron and a few others rowed John Redwood to an island in the barge. There was no shelter at all, and Byron felt sorry for him. They ignored their orders to just drop Redwood off and leave him. They built him a little hut and started a fire. Then they left him to fend for himself. A few days later, Byron took the barge to the island to bring the poor guy what little food they could miss, with plans to bring him back. But they found him stiff as a board, deceased. They were now 17, with 2 hiding. One night, they were alarmed by a strange cry which sounded like a man drowning. Many ran out of their huts toward where the noise seemed to come from. It wasn't far offshore. In the moonlight, they could kind of make out the appearance of a man swimming half out of water. The noise that this creature made was so unlike that of any animal they'd heard before. The company was shook by the sight, and the image haunted them for a long time. Team Cheap became extremely impatient to leave the island. The days were now nearly at their longest and about midsummer in these parts, but apparently the weather didn't change with the seasons. All they needed was for the storms to let up so they could embark and sail north. Bulkeley had never in his life in any part of the world seen such a sea as ran at the mouth of the Magellan Strait. The Speedwellians expected every wave to swallow them and take the boat asunder. With many islands and rocks on either shore, the Speedwell had to stay in the middle of the sea. That evening, the Speedwell suddenly turned broadside, leaning so far over that the mast nearly touched the water. It was about to capsize. No one believed she'd straighten up again. They were doomed, caught in hurricane winds with rainy weather obstructing their view and an arm's throw away from the rocks. Everyone earnestly started praying for the weather to clear, their only chance of salvation. No sooner had they asked for light than it was granted from above. The weather cleared up, and they saw land on the north side with islands, rocks, and breakers all around them. Every other wave could bury them, but they needed to find shelter now. They hauled the Speedwell into the harbor, where the water was as smooth as in a mill pond. The men no longer doubted the existence of an almighty being, and they all promised to reform their lives. They called their haven the Port of God's Mercy, because their rescue truly had been a miracle. As they sailed out again the following day, they saw 2 Indians lying on their bellies peering down over the rock at them. The Speedwellians motioned for them to come down, but they stood up shouting, "Orza! Orza!" Did that mean welcome? 2 unarmed men went ashore. They didn't want to scare the Indians, who only carried clubs to kill seals. Shouting, "Orza! Orza!" they kept running, beckoning the men to follow them. The moment the Speedwell duo lost sight of the vessel, the Indians ran into the woods. They wanted the sailors to come with them. The duo turned around. Not without weapons, they weren't. At 6 a.m., they saw the 2 Indians again shouting, "Orza!" Now Bulkeley and 4 others went ashore, following the running Indians who kept looking over their shoulders, making signs to follow. Finally, they reached a canoe that had 4 more Indians in it. They pushed offshore and signed they wanted clothes. The Speedwellians signed they wanted fish and would trade them for it. The men signed they would get them some. Ashore, they found plenty of mussels and brought the fish aboard and shared, to everyone's great relief. They stayed at this location for a few days, catching fish, seal, all excellent food, but barely enough to keep them from starvation. On November 14th, they sailed on, and Bulkeley recognized Cape Pillar. They were definitely in the strait. But now the hunger got so severe that more provisions were handed out. The crewmen sold them to each other for valuable goods like silver buckles for flour, but the price went up overnight, and several were close to death. On November 16th, the Speedwell faced Cape Monday, but the officers, who remained mostly below decks, believed they were in some kind of vast lagoon, since they couldn't see the next landmark, Cape Quad. Despite Bulkeley's insistence they were on the right path, the officers put their foot down. "Turn around! Now!" That afternoon, George Bateman, a boy aged 16 years, starved and perished, a skeleton for want of food, and others were equally on death's doorstep. If they didn't get relief soon, they'd also die. While Team Bulkeley turned around to find the right route into the strait, Team Cheap was making preparations to leave on their northern route. The captain ordered Midshipman Campbell to check the wreck again for anything, and he was lucky enough to pick up 3 casks with 53 pieces of very fine beef. It was divided equally among them, and they lived very well, growing stronger every day. They fried all kinds of seaweed, turning it into bread to make beef sandwiches, so hamburgers. Team Cheap got more and more impatient to leave the island, but the weather just wouldn't let up. It would be madness to put out to sea unless they had a good ship. The captain persuaded them to have a little more patience. Everyone calmed down. For a while. Team George Anson's Gloucester was close to Paita to intercept all vessels sailing between Peru, Panama, and Chile. Apparently, those at Valparaiso knew the Brits were right there and embargoed all trade, so Commodore Anson took everyone to join the Gloucester at Paita to intercept any and all ships. Underway, they caught another ship, the Santa Teresa de Jesus, that surrendered after having fired 14 shots. The goods she carried, save for the timber to fix their ships, were of no use to Team Anson. As they tried to find the Gloucester, they caught another ship, the Nostra Senora del Carmen. Now they had over 90 prisoners on board, who were all treated with the utmost respect. Anson received more intelligence. Those in Paita were also aware the Brits were in the hood. The Gloucester had chased a ship that escaped, and the escapees told the townsmen all about their harrowing encounter. Immediately news was sent to all the regions. Those in Paita removed the king's treasure to Piura, 14 leagues inland. But a large sum of money was sitting aboard a vessel bound for Mexico. Still, cruising here was pointless. So the Commodore decided to surprise the place and got all the intel about the strength and condition of Paita from his prisoners. The town only had one fort with 8 cannons, and the place was surrounded by a plain brick wall with a small garrison to defend it. When Anson was convinced there was little to no danger to his crew in attacking the place, he would destroy a Spanish outpost, as per the mission. For the nighttime attack, the Commodore only used boats, since large ships would be seen. Taking a barge and 2 pinnaces, Lieutenant Brett led 58 well-armed men to carry out the assault. 2 Spanish pilots, who were promised a release, would show them the way. If they didn't behave, they'd be shot on the spot, and Anson would carry the rest of the prisoners to England. They were seen just as they entered the bay, with men rowing toward the fort shouting, "The English! The English dogs!" And the whole town was alarmed. But the Brits put their backs into it, determined to give the enemy as little time to prepare as possible. But the garrison manned the cannons and fired at the landing place, narrowly missing 1 boat. But Team Anson was disembarked before the second gun fired. The 60 sailors entered the town, drums sounding and huzzahs shouting, which made them seem like a force of 300. Most people fled and didn't fight. Only the merchants who owned the treasure in the harbor fired at them from the governor's house. But when the Brits returned fire, they ran. The group split up. One seized the governor's house, the other took the fort. Both had been abandoned. The whole place was conquered in under 15 minutes. They raised the English flag at the fort, and at 7 a.m. the other ships came in. 1 man was killed on the spot, and 2 were wounded, one of whom was one of the Spanish pilots. The Brits seized the customs house where the treasure lay and started transporting the loot. Some soldiers went on a pillage and plunder spree. They stole the glitzy outfits the Spaniards had left behind, putting them on over their own dirty trousers and jackets. They put wigs and hats over their greasy hair. Once the men's clothes ran out, some dressed up in the fancy women's dresses. The metamorphosis looked positively grotesque. Lieutenant Brett didn't even recognize his men at first. The enemy now gathered on a hill at the back of the town, looking quite intimidating. There were at least 200 horse, well armed and mounted, and a trained army with trumpets, drums and standards. The Brits weren't worried. They wouldn't dare come in between the houses, but to be sure, they barricaded the streets. That night, Anson added more soldiers. They cleared the place of all food, drink and treasure they could store. On November 15th, the Commodore had the cannons disabled, released all 88 prisoners and set the town, save 2 churches, ablaze. They took the treasure ship, the Soledad, with them and scuttled and sank the other 6 in the harbor. So now the fleet consisted of the Centurion, the Gloucester, the Trials Prize, the Carmelo, the Teresa, the Carmine and the Soledad. The total loss was later reported to be $1.5 million. The Brits came away with £30,000 besides jewelry. And as the prisoners reported about their decent and generous treatment, the myth about the heretical and cruel Brits was busted in those parts. When Anson found out that Admiral Vernon's attack on Cartagena had failed, he headed for Acapulco to capture that Manila galleon. But first the Soledad and the Santa Teresa were stripped for parts, then burned. In hail and snow, Team Bulkeley moved back along the strait, or well, possibly a lagoon. They set on land whenever they could to get mussels, which gave them reasonable relief, but the price of flour kept going up. On November 19, 1741, Thomas Capel, 12 years old, was so close to dying that he begged with prayers and tears the guardian who held his money, a watch and a silver cup, to give him his small inheritance to buy food to save his life. But the jerk told him he could use the money for clothes and pretty things once they got to Brazil. The dying boy cried out, "I will never see Brazil. I am even now starved almost to death. Therefore, for God's sake, have compassion on me, and give me my silver cup to procure me a little food, or buy some for me yourself, so that I may be relieved from my insufferable torture. A morsel of victual is worth more to me than all the apparel in the world." But his tears and pleas to his stubborn guardian were in vain. Only heaven sent death to his relief, and helped him by stopping his breath. Now hunger mixed with rage aboard the Speedwell. No one believed they'd make it, and wanted only food and more food. But they had to save food, since until they got to Brazil, they couldn't set on land anywhere. But there was no reasoning with them. Meanwhile, they sailed on, weather permitting, to find the right strait. Team Bulkeley realized that Sir John Norborough's journal was not as precise as they thought, and they ran up a few dead ends. The lieutenant and the gunner kept bickering about where they were, with Baines not even believing they were south of the strait. Bulkeley knew better. On November 30th, the barber Peter Delroy, Marines Thomas Thorpe and Thomas Woodhead died for want of food. Many more were close to death, and not being able to land on a shore, those who were still well simply didn't have enough to share, lest they end up in the same miserable condition. Whatever pity the men had was now all spent. They witnessed a strange phenomenon of dying. Some people, hours before they died, became lightheaded and fell down joking and laughing, playing ridiculous pranks as though they were really happy, and that's how they expired. They saw Indians ashore, but never got close enough to trade anything. The Speedwellians had been sailing an uncomfortable journey against the wind for 17 days now, and only now and then could they land and get shellfish. On November 5th at 3 p.m., they saw Cape Deseada and Cape Pilar. So, now the lieutenants admitted that they had been in the correct strait all along. Bulkeley was vindicated, but it was a hollow victory. They could have been out of the strait 2 weeks ago. Now they had to do it all over again. Fortunately, they knew the way. Team Bulkeley finally saw Cape Quod a day later. On the south shore, they saw smoke. They went ashore to meet the Indians standing on a cliff hollering, "Bona! Bona!" They tried to make them understand that they were friends. These people were also dressed in animal hides, but their hair was shorter than the Coescar. They traded with them for 2 dogs, 3 geese, and some seal. Team Bulkeley immediately prepared the dogs and ate it as if it were mutton. They also got a canoe, but when they towed her behind the Speedwell, she sank, and they had to cut her loose. Point by point, they moved along the strait. St. Jerome Sound, Royal Island, Cape Froward, and Port Famine. The latter was named after an unfortunate incident in 1584, when the Spanish tried to colonize the strait to control access to it. The colony had 300 settlers, including soldiers, Franciscan priests, women, and children. They ran out of food in the winter and were found dead 3 years later. Along they went: Freshwater Bay, Elizabeth Island, Sandy Point, the island of St. George. At Elizabeth Island they found no wood or water, but they found seagull eggs, but most had chicks in them. No matter, they beat it all together with a bit of flour into a very rich pudding. Meanwhile, the Marines John Turner and Robert Vickers died for want of food. As Narborough had described, the channel began to constrict. They entered the first narrow, only 2 miles wide and therefore treacherous. On December 10th, they left the first narrow and holed into a deep bay to look for water. The boatswain swam ashore and returned to the beach half an hour later, saying he'd found fresh water. On December 11th, the tide went out so fast that they were on dry land within 15 minutes. Fortunately, there was no wind, or the boat, now out of water, would have broken apart. But now everyone could walk ashore to fill the water casks. Unfortunately, once they got back in the boat, they had to dump it all, or they'd be stuck in the shallow water. They also left guns and ammo, and even considered leaving people behind so they wouldn't lose the Speedwell. At noon, they'd arrived in the Atlantic Ocean and saw Cape Virgin Mary, the place they'd seen months before. The journey through the strait had taken them 31 days, a week faster than Ferdinand Magellan and his armada. On December 12th, they noticed horsemen riding towards them, and judging by, well, everything, they were Christians. Castaways? Inhabitants? But they couldn't get into the bay and sailed on. It was still another 1,600 miles to Rio Grande in Brazil, passing Spanish territory all the way there. But they felt they were on the home stretch. On December 15, 1741, according to Team Cheap's calendar, the crewmen figured the weather was tolerable enough to leave Wager Island. But Captain Cheap told them to come with him to the observation spot on Mount Misery. They could see the cape, some 20 or 30 leagues from Wager Island, only on good days. Cheap peered through his looking glass and gave it to Campbell, who saw a very rough sea on the horizon. They'd never make it. The captain and the midshipmen told the bad news to those at base camp, but they didn't care. They wanted to get out of there yesterday. The people asked the captain if they should launch the boat, to which he replied, "With all my heart, if you will, but you'll find a great sea without." At about 9 a.m. they launched the boat. The barge and the yawl were smaller than the cutter and only had wooden cross planks for seats. Both had masts, but while technically they could sail, they'd mostly use oars. Captain Cheap, Midshipman Byron and Surgeon Elliot were in the barge with 8 rowers. Lieutenant Hamilton and Midshipman Campbell were in the yawl with 6 rowers. It was 100 miles to get around the point and out of the Gulf of Distress, and another 250 to get to Chiloé Island. Only an hour or so into their journey, the wind picked up and shifted. The sea got so rough they feared they'd sink soon. To stay afloat, they threw overboard nearly everything they had, including the beef that they had salvaged from the wreck. Another frying pan fire situation. They had avoided immediate death, but would starve later. The terrible seas pushed them toward the shore and it got dark. Just bailing with hands and hats wasn't enough, and Campbell, steering the yawl, and Hamilton sat with their backs against the stern to block the waves from completely swamping the boat. Both men believed that nothing less than a miracle could save them from destruction. Byron steered the barge and also had men sit as close together as possible with their backs against the sea to keep most water out. So they couldn't sail straight for the Cape, which seemed so close, and needed to find a bay for the night. Those in the barge lost sight of the yawl. Those in the yawl lost sight of the barge, except every now and then they saw each other on the top of a mountainous sea. The wind drove them fast toward shore, where the sea broke frightfully. They were all preparing to meet their maker. Just as they braced to go under as the first breaker hit them, those in the yawl noticed a small opening between some rocks. It was a narrow passage with hardly any room for the oars, but they sailed into a harbor that was as smooth as a mill pond. It was so calm, in fact, they had to row. Not long after, the barge also entered the same place, guided there by Providence. Their reunion was a happy one, but their troubles were far from over. There were many inlets, but it being dark, it was too dangerous to venture further. They secured the boats and climbed onto a rock. They couldn't find firewood and lay down in a hollow without cover. Their situation on Wager Island was bad, but this was much worse. It was bitterly cold, and no one had a dry thread on their body, and then it started to freeze. On December 16th, at noon, Team Bulkeley sailed past Penguin Island, which was covered in, you wouldn't have guessed it, penguins, but also seals. At 5 p.m., they entered a harbor. They spent half an hour seal clubbing on a nearby island, but they killed more than they could carry and left most meat behind. After the meat was roasted on a fire, the people fell on the meat as if they hadn't eaten in days, which they hadn't. But eating so fast and so much when you're half dead from starvation is dangerous. The people fell ill with violent fevers and headaches. It's called refeeding syndrome, which can lead to shock and even death. At least one castaway died from eating the food that he thought would save his life. While they didn't see any Spaniards, thank heavens for that, Carpenter Cummins found a stack of bricks with letters carved into them. Straighten, 16 cannons, 1687. A wrecked vessel. Now the people grew restless and agitated. They wanted flour, an unreasonable request. They only had one cask left, and they still had a great distance to go. The seal they'd killed would rot in days, but they went further. The naval officers and other people who weren't working the boat should only have half the allowance. They picked 20 who would get only half a pound each, and well, they would starve. Team Cheap nearly froze to death. They'd hardly slept and had nothing to eat. But the weather was calmer, and the captain didn't tolerate any dilly-dallying and ordered everyone back on the boats. They tugged oars all day on account of the wind. As they progressed, they named every place they stayed at: Swamp Bay, Redwood Cove, and the Duke of Montrose's Island. They found what they called sea tangle, a seaweed that grew on submerged rocks, and the surgeon once shot a goose, which Captain Cheap cooked. But they often found nothing to eat, and they had to sleep on their oars. Once they were so hungry, they ate their shoes made of raw seal skin. At another time, 2 crewmen were buried under a collapsed cliff, but they got away with only bruises. When they thought they had found the last bay of the Gulf of Distress, they thought the journey was over. It wasn't. Then, by their accounts, it was Christmas Day, but who's to say? They feasted on sea tangle and Adam's wine, that is just water, which they drank to the king's health. That night, the yawl was swamped by an unexpected breaker. Thankfully, they were able to empty it, or they would have had to leave her behind. Those in the yawl were in terrible shape. They had nothing to eat or drink and were soaking wet. When they asked those on the barge for food, water, dry clothes, anything, despite them clearly having water, they told them no. They slept on oars again that night, trembling with cold and hunger. On December 26th at 3 a.m., Team Bulkeley sailed out along Penguin Island and past Cape Blanco. 2 days later, they served out the last flour on board, 3.5 pounds a man. With many more leagues to go, all they had to live on was seal and whatever fate threw their way. And their seal was running out fast. Water was running low as well. Meanwhile, they hadn't seen land for weeks, and they were surrounded by whales. On January 6, 1742, Purser Thomas Harvey passed away, a skeleton for want of food. As Bulkeley remarked, probably the first purser in His Majesty's service ever to starve. A few days later, they were suddenly surrounded by insects, butterflies, and horse stingers and such. Only 15 or so were healthy, if healthy meant those who could barely crawl. Gunner Bulkeley seemed to be the strongest man on the boat, and he could barely stand for 10 minutes at a time, and then only when he was holding on to something. Those who were in the best of health tried to encourage the rest. This encouragement did nothing for Marine Sergeant Ringle, who perished for want of food on January 10, 1742. At 4 p.m., they saw the shore for the first time in 14 days, but they couldn't land. At 4 a.m. the following morning, they set out again, watching many galloping horses and dog packs running on the shore. They had no way to reach them. At noon, they entered a bay, close to what they figured was Cape Andrews, but since the place was riddled with shoals, they couldn't land. Food had run out, and they only had 1 cask of water to drink. They wanted to get as close to the shore so that even the worst swimmer could get ashore, but the surf was too large and would endanger the vessel. However, continuing without food or water meant certain death. Some needed to swim ashore. Gunner Bulkeley needed to stay at the helm. He couldn't swim anyway. But Boatswain John King, Carpenter John Cummins, and Marine Lieutenant Robert Ewers jumped in to swim to shore. Their bravery encouraged 11 more to do the same. While 13 reached the shore, 1 Marine, James Greenham, began to struggle some 18 feet from land. The others, too far away to help him, watched him drown. Bulkeley threw 4 empty casks to fill with fresh water overboard and let the surf wash them ashore. He tied 2 firelocks to 1 barrel and added ammunition. The 13 swimmers saw dogs, horses, parrots, armadillos, and seals, but there was no brush anywhere. They called the place Port Desire. The swimmers made fire with horse dung and burned the wood from a leaky cask. They shot a multitude of seals and 4 armadillos, which they cooked and prepared to bring aboard. Of course, the swimmers ate some first, and those starving on the boat felt worse than ever, watching the freshly cooked meat pile up with no way to reach it. There were 2 people left on the boat who could swim. The lieutenant and Bulkeley tried to get the Speedwell even closer to shore and made a raft for them to swim to shore on, with a line so that they could hold back some of the seal. After a lot of begging, the 2 swimmers drew lots. The weakest of them, a 15-year-old who could barely stand, lost, but the others wouldn't let him get in the water. Instead, they took down a sealskin tarp, burned off the hair, and for want of anything else, chewed the sealskin. The following morning, the boatswain shot a horse, while others shot a wild dog. They discovered the horse had the letters AR branded on the left flank, so the owners couldn't be far off. While Bulkeley dropped more empty casks in the surf, Ewers, Cummins, and King, along with 4 others, swam back with the seal and horse meat. But the moment they got into the vessel, the wind picked up, and the Speedwellians were forced to move a league away from the shore. They ate the provisions, while seeing the 8 baffled swimmers standing there on land, watching the Speedwell move away from shore. She was coming back, right? Well, the wind blew hard that night, and a great wave broke the Speedwell's rudder head. The vessel could break apart at any moment, drowning everyone on board. They had to get out of there. They dropped a cask with 4 muskets, powder and ball, coins, candles and other supplies, with a letter to tell them the Speedwell was in danger, and they couldn't wait for the weather to clear to pick them up. They also drew up a letter for the Lords of the Admiralty explaining their decision to leave the men stranded, along with their names and coordinates. Those left behind, Midshipman Isaac Morris, Coxswain Guy Broadwater, and sailors John Duck, Samuel Cooper, Benjamin Smith, Joseph Clinch, John Allen, and John Andrews, were stunned at this betrayal, which they dubbed the greatest act of cruelty. They discussed their situation, comforting each other with imaginary hopes, and figured that for now they should make camp on the beach, eat as much food as possible to build strength, and then undertake the long, arduous journey to Buenos Aires overland. On December 29, 1741, Team Cheap finally reached the last cape, well, the one they could see, to escape the Gulf of Distress. They got out early, but the wind blew very hard, the sea was massive, and everyone wished they were back in the bay again. They returned, but once more they were forced to sleep on the oars that night. The weather didn't improve the following day either, so they went ashore and found nothing but tangle and seaweed to eat. With the weather not improving, they spent the next few days looking for provisions. They found a nice lagoon at the head of the bay, killed some seals and got a good deal of shellfish, which was a great relief. But that darn cape was taunting them. On January 17, 1742, Team Cheap tried to round the cape again. There were in fact 3 capes, all the same size, which the Spanish called Tres Montes. They rounded the first, then had to row to get past the second, but the sea beyond that one was horrific. Night was coming on, and unable to find harbors between the capes, they had to return to the bay from which they set out. The following day, all hands went ashore to find sustenance, except 4 men who remained in the boats as boat keepers. Quartermaster William Rose and his partner were in the yawl, Midshipman Byron and his partner were in the barge. Byron was supposed to keep a weather eye out, but he was too exhausted and fell asleep. He woke from the strange rocking motion of the barge. The wind had picked up, and the 2 boats were surrounded by breakers. Byron heard shrieking, someone was in distress. He saw the yawl, upside down, drifting out to sea. Then she went under, and William Rose drowned. His fellow boat keeper, a marine, washed ashore with his head buried in the sand. Those on the beach quickly dug him out and saved him. The 7, who called the yawl their home for the past few weeks, mourned her disappearance. All their clothes, arms, and other possessions were lost with her. But the barge was about to suffer the same fate. However, Byron and his fellow boat keeper pulled hard to safety away from the breakers. The barge's keepers were stuck there all day in a heavy sea, not knowing their fate. Even more cruel, they were starving and freezing, but could see their companions ashore eating seal. What was left of Team Bulkeley, 34 men, now only had a pint of water per man per day. On January 19th, they anchored in a sandy bay, and they saw 2 men on horseback. The boatswain jumped into the water and swam ashore. He got on the back of one of their horses and rode away. The Speedwellians were out of water, so several men swam to shore to bring some. But first, these men gulped down a lot. One of them drank too much, and he was so weak that he drowned on his way back to the Speedwell. But the men felt better having water again. The following day, Carpenter Cummins and Gunner Bulkeley went ashore. 4 horsemen appeared. They were Castilian fishermen. Since Bulkeley spoke Portuguese, they could understand each other. The men were from the town Mount Vidia, that is Montevideo, a 2-day journey from this place. The fishermen told them that the English were still at war with the Spaniards, and the English had several first-rate men of war in the area, one of which, with 70 guns, wrecked and was lost with all hands perished. They didn't know her name. Cummins and Bulkeley each got on a horse and rode a mile to their place. They were given quality beef jerky and good white bread. They wanted to buy some, but the men didn't want to part with their scarce supplies for less than 4 guineas a loaf, worth 2 pennies in England. Bulkeley was too weak to argue and gave them their price. The gang's confessor, a Spanish priest, told them that if anyone found out the fishermen had sold them their bread, they'd all be hanged. But the padre promised that if they gave him a gun, he would shoot enough ducks to feed all those on the Speedwell. He'd be back in an hour or 2. Cummins had his firelock sent over from the boat and handed it to the padre with some ammo. They waited for 2 hours, but the priest hadn't returned. However, they noticed that one of the horsemen had disappeared. They feared he'd betray them, so they returned to the Speedwell quickly, without the duck, and down one gun. Team Bulkeley sailed along toward Rio Grande, their destination, but the people on the boat so close to Deliverance were still dying. On January 23rd, Master Thomas Clark passed away, the man who had wanted to save his son. But alas, young Clark died the following day, just as they saw the mainland. As soon as they settled in a bay, they held a solemn funeral for Master Clark and his son, and committed them to the sea. The following day at 9 a.m., they had wind in their teeth, that is a headwind, and they decided to sail back to an island they had passed a little while ago, where they had seen many seals on the rocks. They were unable to get to shore because it was surrounded by rocks and breakers. Meanwhile, they had thunder and lightning all day. The following morning, January 26th, they got under sail. They were only a few leagues off Rio Grande and their desired port. On this day, the oldest man among them passed away, the 82-year-old cook Thomas McLean. They sailed again the following day, and with only water to sustain them, they hoped to see the Rio Grande the next day, January 28th. Finally, on January 27th, Midshipman Byron could move the barge closer to the shore, where the men threw the boatkeepers some seal's liver. They ate it so greedily that it made them sick. Team Cheap now had a dilemma. There were 18 people and only one boat, the barge. They couldn't all fit, so they decided to leave 4 Marines who couldn't work the boat behind: Smith, Hales, Hartford, and Corporal Roland Crosset. Worn out from all the miseries they'd already endured, the men didn't seem to care either way. The captain gave these poor fellows some arms and ammunition, a frying pan, and a few other supplies. As the barge sailed away to once more try to round Tres Montes, the 4 Marines stood on the beach. Those in the barge gave them 3 cheers. The poor wretches called out, "God bless the King!" Then they turned around and helped each other climb over a rocky path with nothing but dense wood and swamps beyond them. That little trek was surely a forlorn hope. About half a mile from shore, the barge approached the shipwrecking breakers, but they didn't care anymore. When a mountainous wave lifted the barge high up, the men just lay on the oars, welcoming an end to their lives and misery. When death didn't greet them, nobody said anything for a while. At last, Captain Cheap told them they must either perish immediately or pull stoutly away from shore. Their choice. They chose to pull, and with insane efforts made it around the cape. But at last they had to concede that rounding Tres Montes was impossible in an open boat. They gave up and returned to Marines Bay, where they'd marooned the men. It was dark by the time they arrived. They couldn't risk a landing in the rough seas. They'd lose the barge and all hope of ever getting home. Home being Wager Island. No one wanted to try to round the Cape again. While some wanted to return to Wager Island and give up on getting back to England, others wanted to ditch the barge and try to get to Chiloé over land, but they could still drown because of the many swamps. Finally, everyone agreed. They would return to Wager Island, their home away from home, and die there. But they were going to need food if they were going to make it all the way back. So they'd swing by the lagoon to get some seal, but before they left, they first looked for the 4 Marines. Team Cheap had decided, against better judgment, to take them on board. Sure, they might all perish, but they were resigned to their fate. If the boat sank, they would die all together. After sailing all night, on January 28, 1742, at 6 a.m., Team Bulkeley, 30 weary, hungry, and thirsty souls, saw the opening of the River Grande, the very gate of heaven. Bulkeley deftly steered around the many shoals and bars toward the settlement of Rio Grande, and at last, after several hours, they finally went for anchor opposite the town. They'd reached their destination. It had taken them 3.5 months. Almost immediately, a boat approached them, and they were boarded by a Portuguese army sergeant and a soldier. Who were they? Bulkeley managed to stand and answered, "We are part of the crew of the HMS Wager, which had sunk 8 months earlier off the coast of Chile." The men looked at the frightful crew of starvelings with a mix of horror and compassion. Lieutenant Baines, Gunner Bulkeley, Carpenter Cummins, and Captain Pemberton of the land forces went ashore with them to certify to the governor who they were, where they came from, and what their business was. On land, they received a most warm welcome from the locals and the garrison. The 4 officers were taken to the surgeon's house, where they received hospitable treatment, while the others were taken to shore and fed. At 4 p.m., the governor, who'd been out of town, returned. He was courteous, but also suspicious they might be spies. He questioned the lieutenant and the gunner. Did they have a map on board? No. How dare they venture out without one? They had a book. How did they clear the bar at the mouth of the river? Well, thanks to a merciful God, Bulkeley's good eye the day before, and the Speedwell's shallow draft. The governor, satisfied they weren't impostors, regarded the men with great pity, and embraced the 4 men as friends, calling their deliverance a miracle. He assured the lieutenant they would want for nothing, and took Baines and Pemberton with him to stay at his house. He ordered the commandant to see that everyone was given more food and that the sick were taken to the hospital. He then told them that the Severn and the Pearl, the 2 ships they had lost sight of in the Drake Passage, had undergone many grievous disasters, though nothing like what they suffered. They had sailed to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and were anchored there in a distressed condition. The Severn lost so many crewmen to disease that they had hardly any men left in her by the time she arrived. The Pearl had done little better and was also nigh depopulated. In fact, so many crewmen had died that they didn't have enough to navigate the ship. The captains had to wait until the flota sailed before they could get new crews, around June. Then the governor asked for the Speedwell to be brought as close to shore as possible. Once this was done, all the inhabitants flocked in droves to see the little ark. No one could believe it had contained so many men. The governor doubted the Speedwell could take them much further and promised to put them on the first vessel to Rio de Janeiro, so they could join the Pearl and the Severn and return to England. The Speedwellians felt bad they had nothing to repay them with, and instead gave the governor and his men 3 cordial cheers. Bulkeley said, "In which time I believe no mortals have experienced more difficulties and miseries than we have. This day may be justly styled the Day of Deliverance, and ought to be remembered accordingly." But if you thought Team Bulkeley was safe and sound, you'd be gravely mistaken. Their journey home was fraught with more drama, and the stories of Team Cheap, Team Morris, and Team Anson are far from over. But that's for the next episode, Unfortunate Adventures. Until then.